Hello, it's a pleasure to be with all of you today for Avasant's Empowering Beyond and Transcending Digital conference. I'm Jyoti Chopra, Chief People, Inclusion and Sustainability Officer for MGM Resorts International. So I'm going to talk about how we embrace humanity and protect the planet. And we'll touch on some aspects of environmental, social, and governance factors, diversity and inclusion, and sustainability. To set some context, if we go to the first slide, let me begin at a macro level, really setting the stage for some of the driving forces behind what I call the rise of ESG, environmental, social, and governance factors. And what you see articulated here are statements from three CEOs, BlackRock, State Street Global Advisors, and my president and CEO at MGM Resorts. And what you see here is really a call for organizations to demonstrate purpose in delivering value to customers, employees, communities, and really having a long-term view around their raison d'etre, if you will, and thinking beyond the four walls of their organization and far beyond profit. And so what's happened in recent years is the rise of a call to action, if you will, by leading institutional investors, encouraging boards, CEOs, members of executive management to really begin to focus on purpose, long-term shareholder interest, as well as contributing to society at large. And this is very much a pervasive trend that is on the rise and going to continue. If we go to the next slide, I want to bridge over to the topic of talent and just share with you what's happening in and around the talent landscape. And what you see articulated here are just a few of some of the leading people trends. And there are a few things I want to call out. The first is the rapidly changing dynamic around the talent landscape. And it's being fueled in large part by technology and technology disruption, which is creating, for example, new ways of working, a gig economy where people all of a sudden can have multiple employers and be working on a real-time basis. It's changed the dynamic around traditional careers and career paths, as well as mobility, with many more people, and particularly during the pandemic, turning to remote working models. And the labor market in many countries has just become incredibly tight. Some of that is through natural forces, and others through immigration reform and limitations on visas, for example. And you've seen the rise of interest in areas like diversity, equity, and inclusion. All of this makes for a very complex landscape, and particularly if you're a company that is dependent on people and human capital, your ability to hire, retain and develop people becomes challenging. Go to the next slide. I want to segue into what are some of the themes and drivers behind the changes in the marketplace. The first is really thinking about this from the lens of people and community. I touched on the fact that employers are competing even more fiercely than ever for talent and for customers. But what we've seen is a shift in the expectations of talent from their employers. The employee experience, an employee wanting to become engaged and have a relationship with their company, far beyond a paycheck and a job and a title, is very much on the rise. But there are other factors. For example, you have 4 generations in the workforce today. The rise of multiculturalism, expectations have changed, and there's a heightened social consciousness, which is all making for a very complicated labor market, talent landscape, and changes in the way employers recruit and retain their talent. If we go to the next slide, what you also see here is what I call the rise of social movements. And these have taken the form of advocacy and large-scale public movements. I've captured some of them here, ranging from Black Lives Matter, social justice, disability rights, advocacy for the LGBTQ plus community, gun violence, as examples. But what's happened is that as a result of the advocacy and the public outcries and calls for reforms, there's increasing pressure on employers and corporations to respond. You're seeing now a trend where many more companies are starting to take stands, issue public statements, and CEOs very much engaging in conversations around these topics with their employees and stakeholders. As an example, at my own company, MGM Resorts International, we launched a new series called Courageous Conversations, actually led by our CEO and president, Bill Hornbuckle, with the involvement and participation of members of our board of directors, with employees from diverse communities, to really listen and understand and hear their sentiments and how they're feeling, and really getting to have conversations in a way that we've never had before. And this is something that I'm seeing a trend, and many more companies are embarking on. If we go to the next slide, the third big shift has been the rise of disclosure legislation and regulation. And what you see noted here are a handful of fairly landmark legislative mandates that have come to pass in the US as well as in the UK on a range of areas. American disabilities, we have marriage equality in the UK in 2017, for example. The UK government instituted mandatory gender pay gap reporting for employers that had more than 250 employees. So every year, if you had more than 250 employees, you have to publish an annual gender pay gap report. What this has led to is companies now looking within their four walls and having to set up an infrastructure and a mechanism to be able to meet these legislative requirements, to be able to report on these and to disclose on these, and to set up standards, policies, practices. And this trend is very much on the rise. If we go to the next slide, what you see shown here are our efforts at MGM Resorts to align our work in social impact and sustainability and in diversity and inclusion with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These were goals that were put into place a few years ago by the United Nations. There are 17 goals. These are long-term goals for sustainable development. And what we did at MGM Resorts was to really look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, use it as a framework, and to see how and where we could align our work in corporate social responsibility to some of these areas. And so what you see here on the far right is the mapping of 3 very specific UN Sustainable Development Goals that we are incorporating in our work around diversity and inclusion. And so this is an example of how we've included and incorporated this into our framework. And my last slide here lays out for you the beginning of a framework. And as you think about an approach to sustainability, to diversity and inclusion, or corporate social responsibility, think about what it is you want to stand for. At MGM Resorts, we've chosen to focus on what matters. And for us, it's 2 things: embracing humanity and protecting the planet. So it's about people and the planet. And you see articulated here 4 pillars through which we are rolling out a range of programs and work in this area. And I'll show you our framework on the next slide, if we bring that up, because that gives you a clearer picture of how we bring this to life. So our pillar of diversity and inclusion centers around fostering diversity and inclusion. And the work and the programs are around people, culture, suppliers, and our customers. On the philanthropy and community engagement, it's about caring for our communities. And for us at MGM Resorts, that's about workforce development, education, and alleviating food insecurity. And on the environmental sustainability side, that's protecting the planet. And our emphasis is in the area of water, energy, and materials. And you see in this framework how we map to the UN Sustainable Development Goals with the view to achieving marketplace leadership and eminence. And so this is our framework for social impact and sustainability. It's a long-term framework that runs through 2025. Against each of these areas, we have clearly defined goals with KPIs and metrics that we report on to management as well as to our board of directors. And I think what's important in the construct of any framework like this is really how you bring it to life, how you cascade it around the organization, how you drive adoption and awareness, and how you get buy-in from your stakeholders. So I hope that this has helped and it's given you a little bit of a glimpse into how we approach our work in the area of environmental, social, and governance and sustainability at MGM Resorts. Thank you.
Welcome, Jyoti. First of all, thank you very much for giving the closing keynote at Empowering Beyond Digital 2021. Your presentation was really remarkable, especially in this day and age, talking about embracing humanity and protecting the planet. You referred to the UN SDGs, which I think are an imperative for every organization. And you talked about how, all of these areas, diversity, inclusion, sustainability, should be part of every organization's DNA, right? So I'd like to get some more insights from you. Las Vegas has seen a significant impact from COVID due to the drop in tourism arrivals. How has MGM fared through this period, and how have you adapted to the new realities? How has the media and entertainment industry changed as a whole?
Yes, well, it's wonderful to be with all of you. It's been a very traumatic, difficult, challenging period for the hospitality, entertainment, gaming industry. If I go back to March of 2020, literally in a matter of days, we had to shut down more than 29 locations. We furloughed 2/3 of our workforce, shut down all operations for the first time in MGM Resorts' history. So just think about the mechanics of that. We were a workforce at the time of the pandemic of 82,000 people. Operating in 29 different locations. We had food that had been brought in for banquets, events, for hospitality. We had customer bookings. So it wasn't just shutting down physical premises and putting our people on furlough, but we had food that we had to get out of the buildings and the properties, for example, out to distribution centers. So it was very much crisis management from the get-go and the onset of the pandemic. But we chose to lead from a real-time perspective, day-to-day, real-time. Secondly, we also led from a people-first perspective, which really meant thinking about the crisis and the pandemic through the lens of our guests, our customers, and our employees. And what could we do to ensure the health and safety above all for both? Health and safety became paramount for us. And so we set up a center of excellence for health and safety. We launched a 7-point health and safety plan. So there were a number of things that we instituted fairly quickly from the onset of the pandemic.
So often inclusive and sustainable policies are seen as either compliance prerogatives or a cost center. Is this perspective shifting, and how can we make this an economic imperative?
The sentiment is changing, and it's changing for a number of reasons. What I would call, first of all, the rise of ESG, environmental, social, and governance factors. And that's been predominantly fueled by institutional investors, Fidelity, State Street, BlackRock. When you have the Larry Finks of the world really taking this to heart, issuing an annual letter to CEOs and really calling for reforms in quite unprecedented ways, it's really led to an escalation, if you will, of these topics into the C-suite and into the boardroom in ways that we've never seen before. The second has been really, as I showed in my presentation, a spate of legislative advancements that have started to take place around the world, where you've now got mandates in certain countries around things like gender pay gap reporting. So when something like that gets introduced at a country level, governments, private sector companies, corporations have to respond, which means they've got to put the infrastructure in place in order to track gender pay gap. They've got to publish a report once a year for the British government. And so changes like this have led to structural reforms within corporations and within companies.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely. And I think bringing in the gender diversity, inclusiveness also, I think, gives organizations an edge to be more innovative, to think a little bit more out of the box. And in today's market reality, we constantly need to be thinking out of the box.
That's right. Innovation is very much at the forefront of topics around sustainability and sustainable practices. So let me give you a very real lifetime example from MGM. We are getting ready to launch and open a massive solar array in the middle of the desert in southern Nevada. When the solar array opens, which spans thousands of acres, it will power up to 90% of the electricity for all of our properties on the grid. We've done this in partnership with Invenergy and several others. It's been a project a number of years in the making. But it's an example of our company's commitment to sustainability and innovative practices and our commitment to renewable energy. And so what I would say is organizations need to really take a look at their inventory, their current plans, policies, not just for the short term, but very much for the long term. And what can they be doing innovatively and creatively that's going to essentially lead to a far more sustainable future for their workplace, for their environment, as well as for their operations.
Yeah, very true. And talking about sustainability, right? We only have one planet, and its climate is heading towards a catastrophe. How can private sector step up to not only avert this crisis, play a leading role, but also turn this into an economic opportunity of a lifetime?
Yes, I think first and foremost, leadership needs to educate themselves in and around the current climate agenda. A good way to begin is by conducting a risk assessment and particularly looking at your organization through the lens of climate-related risks. And from there, what are the corresponding financial risks and the implications of those on your business, on your operations, on your supply chain, as an example. Many companies are now moving towards setting science-based targets, moving to reduction of emissions and setting very concrete goals as to how they're going to go about doing this. It's complicated, it takes research, it takes development, it takes investment, and you have to educate your workforce as well as your stakeholders. So you've got to take a multi-pronged, long-term view and horizon over this.
Absolutely. So Jyoti, you've had a very interesting career, having worked for a diverse set of companies across different industries. What are the top 2 or 3 attributes that can guide senior executives to become stewards for their company in the coming age of continuous disruption?
Well, I would say develop an innate culture of intellectual curiosity. I'm an avid reader. I talk to people all the time. I try to get out to conferences. I'm on a continuous learning journey. I went back to university in my 40s to do an MBA. And so I'm a big advocate for learning, and I've always been innately curious. I think that's one. Second is immerse in an array of resources, from academia to subject matter experts to topic experts. And one thing I've been very interested in is the intersection of human development and technology. It's a personal passion of mine. It's a space I'm really interested in. I do a lot of work for Toyota Motor North America. And Toyota is probably one of the finest case studies and examples I can give you of disruption, continuous improvement, and change. You look at the history of Toyota, its roots began from a weaving loom. From there, it went into becoming the world's finest automotive manufacturer. We've all heard about and studied lean production methodology that Toyota invented and coined and taught the world about real-time production through its methodology in the plants. But where Toyota is going in the future is really about the future of mobility. They're investing in R&D, and they're looking at what is it that people need in order to live healthy, independent, productive, agile, mobile lives as they live longer. So as the world's population ages, what are the devices, the mobility aids that people need in order to be safe and independent? And so that's a really great example of a company that's continuously innovating and dynamically reinventing itself. And so I take a lot of inspiration from Toyota, and I learn a lot from them every day.
Absolutely, and that's a very inspirational evolutionary story, right, of Toyota. And incidentally, they're a client of ours as well, and we have some interesting stories to talk about maybe another day. So we're on to our last question. Our theme, Transcending Digital, epitomizes the realization that technology has to be tamed and harnessed to enrich human experience and create opportunities for all, right? Digital is just an enabler, not the destination. In our quest for digital supremacy, sometimes we forget that and we let technology define our raison d'etre. So you share your final thoughts on how organizations can bring back the human element and embed diversity, inclusion, and sustainability into their enterprise DNA.
Well, I would say first and foremost, think about culture. Think about the culture that you're trying to achieve, and lead with human purpose. And be very clear about what is it that you stand for from a cultural perspective. What is your purpose? And begin to communicate and cascade that throughout your organization. Use that to inspire, to energize, to engage your people around your mission and what it is you're trying to achieve from a long term. There's a very simple framework that I like to use, which is around the workplace, the workforce, and the marketplace. So the workplace is really about your culture and your environment. The workforce is about your people and the impact through your people that you intend to have. And the marketplace is really about your larger impact on the world around you. And so that's how I would go about beginning to really think about transcending into this new domain and really putting the human piece first.
Well, you put a perfect capstone to our Transcending Digital conference. Really thank you, Jyoti, for participating. And it's been really inspiring having this conversation with you. I look forward to seeing you in person, perhaps at one of your MGM resorts soon. Thank you again.
Thank you, Anupam.